Hello, my name is Dave Ferguson, and I'm the visionary leader for NewThing. And I just want to say thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk to you for a little bit about what it takes to create a movement-making culture, and in particular, our 4R values. For me, a lot of this, and really the motivation, goes right back to Acts chapter 1, verse 8. And what you have there is you have Jesus standing before this close-knit group of apprentices and followers of his, and the very last thing he tells them is, listen, I'm going to have my spirit come on you. You're going to be my witnesses. And when that happens, you're going to go from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. And really, no matter how you take a look at this verse, what he's talking about movement. Whether you want to slice this up by geography, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, ends of the earth, or socio-economically, or ethnically, however you want to do it, what he's talking about is going from here to there. He's talking about movement making. And the reason Jesus is challenging his first followers there with movement making is because movement making is the way you accomplish the mission. And we're just a little bit obsessed with this whole idea of movement making and accomplishing the mission at NewThing. In fact, so much so that we really want all of our churches to have a movement making kind of culture. So that's why I want to start with, what does it look like to have a movement making culture? Well, maybe just this whole idea of culture in general. I think culture is a very powerful thing. As leaders, we often talk about casting a compelling vision and standing before them and saying, hey, here's the next hill we're going to take. And vision is a powerful, powerful tool, but it's not nearly as powerful as a culture. Because while a vision, you might get a chance once a year, or maybe once a quarter, or once a month, or every once in a while to kind of say, hey, here's where we're all going, let's go. Culture is something that works 24/7. It's in the air. It's around you. It's just this. Maybe the best definition that I've ever heard of culture came. I was at an Origins conference several years ago where I heard Erwin McManus speak, and Erwin described culture this way. He said, "Culture is spontaneous, repeated patterns of behavior." Culture, spontaneous, repeated patterns of behavior. And that's always kind of stuck with me. Okay, so that's what it is, to do these things over and over again. And eventually someone who steps into a new culture, they kind of get enculturated and they start doing these things. And that's what we want. We want to create a movement-making culture. Now, I'm going to show you a slide here. And on this slide, this is kind of a model for what culture looks like. And there's three different components, three expanding concentric circles. At the center of it is values. And the values in a culture are the things that you hold dear. They're the convictions that in your head that you know this is theologically accurate. But it's also the passion in your heart. You're going like, this is the way things ought to be. So you have these values. But that alone doesn't make up a culture. The second part is narrative. And narrative is really like story and language. Any strong culture, whether it's a church or you walk into a business that's successful, if those people have been in business together and they've had some success, you'll notice they have a certain speak. They talk a certain way, a certain language. That's a part of their culture. That's a part of the narrative, the second part of culture. But the other part of narrative is both language but also stories. There's stories you tell from the past that reinforce who you are. There's stories you tell of where we won and where we actually lived out those values that we feel passionate about in our heart and are convicted about in our head. So there's narrative. Then the third part of the concentric circle is behaviors. And that one is the crucial one, where you actually do the stories that you talk about and the values you say you hold dear. There's an alignment between all three of those things, the values, the narrative, and the behavior. And candidly, one of the reasons that a lot of churches don't have a strong culture, because they do have certain values that maybe they got from the Bible. They may tell stories, maybe they didn't happen there, but they'll tell them from somewhere. They got them online. They'll tell stories about those values. But if you don't do the stuff, if you don't actually do it, then the whole thing breaks down, and the people who are listening know that, you know what, you don't actually have to do it around here because nobody else does, and that culture actually tells them that. So a strong culture has all three of those points, all three of those kind of elements: values, narrative, and then thirdly, also behaviors. Now, for us to create a movement-making culture, and this is what we're all about at NewThing, I want to introduce you to what we call the 4 R's. And I'll tell you the 4 R's, and then I want to step back and then talk about each of those in regards to how we try to have that as a value. We also tell stories about them, but then we also have certain behaviors and commitments that we live out along those. So here are the four R's. The first one is around reproducing. That's a very important value for us. The second value is around relationships. That's also a very important value for us. The third of the 3 R's is resources. Also a very important value for us. And then the last one is what we call residencies. All four of those make up the 4 R's that are core values for who we are at NewThing. So let's just talk about each of those and break them down very quickly. When we talk about reproducing, reproducing is definitely a value that we have. I mean, whether you start at Acts 1:8, where we see Jesus challenges us on this movement, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the ends of the earth, we believe that in our heads and we're passionate about our hearts. Or whether you go to, the similar passage in Matthew 28, where it says, go and make disciples of everyone. We believe in reproducing at every level. And for some reason that we don't fully understand, it's just something, I think it's a gift. It's kind of a gift that God's given us. We probably have a disproportionate number of people that have an apostolic gifting that are a part of NewThing. And we feel like it's a gift that we have and a gift that we want to share with the broader church really all around the world. So that's kind of, it's a real value for us. And as far as story, the way NewThing got started, more than a decade ago, my youth pastor came to me and said, hey, Dave, I want to do what you did. And I was like, well, what is that? And he said, I want to go plant a church. And truthfully, because I wanted him to be the youth pastor for my kids, I wasn't that excited about it. So I kind of tried to put him off. And I said, well, where are you thinking about planting a church? He said, well, in Denver. I was like, all right. Well, I said, well, why don't you go out there, you check it out, and then we'll come back and talk about it. Just, again, kind of putting it off, hoping it would kind of go away. He goes to Denver, gone less than a week, comes back, and I ask him, how did it go? And he says, it went really well. I was like, how well? He said, it went really well. What do you mean? And he told me he'd already raised $200,000 just on that trip. It was, unbelievable. It was clear that God was at work. So his name was Dave and his wife Heather, we got them up on a stage in front of all of our leaders, and we told them, you know what, it's clear that God is sending them to Denver to start this new church, and if this is true for them, then we think that some of you ought to go with them. And we had 35 people that moved from Chicago, got new jobs, transferred schools, and relocated from Chicago to more than 1,000 miles away to Denver to help start this brand new church. And so we began reproducing churches. Then we reproduced a church in Southern California, and then New York, and then Boston, then Detroit, and Tennessee. And so first of all, it was just across the United States, and then we began to do things internationally. Today, we have more than 1,300 churches that are a part of NewThing, and we're hoping to expand into 9 different regions around the world with our sights set on 10,000 reproducing churches. Reproducing is a value that we have, and that's just one of the stories that we tell. Now, how do we live that out? How do our behaviors actually live out reproducing? Well, one of the things that we ask every reproducing church in NewThing to do is to fill out what we call an MRP. Now, MRP stands for My Reproducing Plan. It's a simple one-page plan that says, here is my intention for this year for how we're going to reproduce. It can be small, it can be large, it can be micro or macro, but at every level, we have goals and intentions, and I want you to hold me accountable for reproducing. Because reproducing and multiplying is how movement making happens, and movement making is how you accomplish the mission, and that's what we're all about. So that's that first value of reproducing. The second value that we have is relationships. This is so important to us. We highly value relationships, just life on life, hanging out, having a good time together. We know that when you're running towards something together, if you're constantly looking to your side or you're looking over your shoulder to see if the guy's stabbing you in the back, you can't run hard. But if you trust one another, you can run hard and fast together towards a goal, and that's what we want to do. We look at like 1 Corinthians chapter 12 that describes the body of Christ. And we believe that idea there where it talks about some of us are the hands and some of us are the mouth and some of us are the feet, that doesn't just apply to the local church. That actually also applies to the global church. We don't just need each other locally, but we need different parts of the body of Christ globally. In a recent trip, I was in India. And while I was in India there, I had a chance to sit down and talk with about a dozen people who were part of the persecuted church. They just had horrific stories, brave, courageous, but horrific stories of suffering for the cause of Christ. And being an American, I don't hear those stories. I don't face that kind of persecution. But getting to be connected with other believers in India through NewThing, it really just challenged my own level of discipleship. How serious am I about my commitment to Christ? I know when I'm with my brothers and sisters from Africa, that now in Africa, that's the fastest growing part of the body of Christ. I need to be connected with them. Our brothers and sisters in Europe bring real, and historically have brought real thought leadership to the body of Christ. We need each other. I think as Americans, we bring some systems kind of thinking and resources that the rest of the world needs. And I think together, okay, through relationships, we need each other. So we need a big picture like that, and that's kind of the stories that we tell, but also little simple things. I was on one of our intranet sites just this morning, and someone had posted something that said, hey, does anybody have a how to plant a church checklist? I think it was actually a church from Southern California. And then one of our churches that's actually in the Detroit area said, hey, I got one here, we'll send it to you. And so that relationship allows us to do things together. So that's kind of the value. Relationships, that's kind of the stories. Now, what's the specific behavior that we want from everyone in regards to relationship? Here it is. We want every church planter, okay, every lead pastor of a reproducing church to be in a network. Because when you fill out that MRP, the My Reproducing Plan, we want you to be in a network that you're able to be challenged, encouraged, and really held accountable to accomplish the things you say you want to accomplish. So in our networks are typically about 4 or 5 churches in a network, and then we'll put 4 or 5 networks in what we call a movement. So again, 4 or 5 churches in a network for relationship building, and then 4 or 5 networks that make up a movement. So the first 2 values we have are reproducing. The second value is relationship. The third value that we have is resources. And again, the sharing of resources is an important value that we have in NewThing. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, if you remember that passage, it just talks about how the Macedonians literally begged, even though they were poor, they begged for the opportunity to share what little they had with other churches. Through NewThing, we now have, like I said, 1,300 churches. Many of those churches are brand new churches. And as brand new churches, none of them were funded centrally through NewThing. But instead, it's through the sharing of resources. Dollars, yes, sometimes. Leaders and people, yes, sometimes. Insight, creative content. Anything that we have, we share with one another. When it comes to resources, we really, like here at Community, the church that I lead in Chicago, we actually set aside 10% of our budget towards multiplying or reproducing. As we look over our shoulder this last year, we've been able to start a number of new churches. We started a new church in Nicaragua in partnership with Compassion International. We started 2 brand new churches in the Philippines with some of our NewThing partners there. We were able to help through our leadership training center start 2 brand new churches on the south side of Chicago in some of the toughest neighborhoods of Chicago, and we're very excited about what they're doing. Also through our leadership training center, helped start a church in the suburbs of Chicago. In addition to that, we're starting a brand new location of Community Christian in a community called Downers Grove. And then on top of all of that, we're getting ready to launch a really exciting initiative. We're going to plant churches in prisons. And all of that happens through this 10% of our own resources that we set aside, because we're so committed to being this kind of movement making and have this movement making culture. So what behavior do we expect of you as a part of a NewThing church? Okay, so we've talked about reproducing relationship, but when it comes to resources, what do we expect? One of the things we challenge every NewThing church to do is to think in terms of giving 10% to multiplying, 10% to reproducing, and to movement-making efforts. What if you gave 10%? Specifically, particularly in the North American region, and this is different in different regions around the world, but in the North American regions, when you get into a network, we ask them to put $5,000, $5,000 of that 10% into a local network. It stays in that local network, doesn't go to the central, but stays in that local network and kind of grows in escrow there. And then you can spend it as a network whenever you want, where you have an opportunity to plant a church or maybe invest in a leadership resident, whatever you see fit that helps multiply these movement-making efforts. So when it comes to resources, we challenge you with 10% of your total budget, but specifically in the North American region, what we do is we ask for $5,000, but that does differ from region to region around the world. Let me tell you the last value. The last value that we have is what we call residencies. And for residencies, in some ways, I look to 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2. And Paul's writing to his young apprentice, Timothy, there. And I think Paul caught the vision that Jesus had in Acts 1:8. But then what he does, he says, okay, that's the vision. Now here's the strategy. And he lays it out there in 2 Timothy 2:2. And what you see there is 4 generations of multiplication. He challenges Timothy, hey, think in terms of how can you do this not once, not twice, not three, but 4 generations of reproducing. And so the term residency is really the idea of how do we reproduce other church planting leaders. A leadership resident is just a church planter in training. I think some of the stories that we have at Community, a guy named Dave Clayton, who leads one of our networks in Nashville, when he started with a whole team of leadership residents who are apprenticing with him to go plant brand new churches. I think about Troy McMahon, who left the church that I lead to go plant and now is leading 2 or 3 networks in Kansas City. He had 3 leadership residents, and as they were launching, before they even had their first service, he had 3 leadership residents that they were training. At our NewThing church in Bergen, Salt, I know they have their CMC, and we're so proud of what they're doing there as they're multiplying leaders through that effort. I know Nairobi Chapel in Nairobi, Kenya. Even right now this year, they have about 100 leaders in what they call their leadership pipeline. They have a 3-track system where you lead yourself, you lead a team, and then you lead a church. And they got about 100 people in that pipeline. I remember the last time I was in Nairobi with Nairobi Chapel folks, they lined up on the stage on one Sunday, 35 of their leadership residents, prayed over them, and then commissioned them to go and plant churches in Kibera, which is the largest slum in Africa. 35 church planters went out that Sunday. And that's the kind of mindset where we're training leadership residents, church planters in training to go out and do that. All right, so what do we expect again? What's the behavior that goes along with this value of residency? Very specifically this. We challenge every one of our NewThing churches to think of 1 resident per site per year. Think in terms of how do you have 1 leadership resident per site per year? Because if you can do that, you'll really be clearly demonstrating this value of multiplying leaders through leadership residency. So you put that all together. When you think about those 4 values, the value of reproducing, the value of relationship, the value of resources, and the value of residency, and you think about, okay, that's the value. You've heard some of the stories that are part of them, but then make sure that we as NewThing churches are actually doing those things, that we're living up to those commitments. Because I'm telling you, when all those things line up, values, narrative, and then a behavior, actually living out those commitments, that's when we'll create a movement-making culture. Thank you very much.